Hi guys, so today I'm going to do a 6-month wrap up. If you don't know what a wrap up is, basically it's just a very quick kind of this is what I've read in this amount of time. Usually people do it month for month, but I'm very bad at keeping track of the books that I've read in a month, so instead I just know that this is the end of the first 6 months of this year, and these are the books that I've read this year. At the start of this year in January I set myself a target of reading 1 book a week. Just because, to be honest, I'd never counted how many books I read in a year, and I wanted to see if I could do that. So it's the end of June now, and I've read 48 books. So unless I become very, very slow over the summer and the start of next year, I'm definitely going to beat that target. So, and I realised this in about April, so since then I've kind of set myself a new target of reading 104 books this year, which is 2 a week. That might be a little bit more difficult, and I probably won't achieve that goal, mainly because I have had more reading slumps in the past month or so than I had kind of at all, so my pace has kind of slowed dramatically. But anyway, here are the books that I have read since January. First up is Wonder by R.J. Palacio. I hope I'm saying that last name right. I don't actually own this book, it was a book that I borrowed from my school library, but here is a beautiful picture of it. This book was really beautiful. It dealt with a kid who was about 10 years old, and he has some health conditions, so he doesn't look the same as everyone else. It's told in different perspectives. The first section is him, and then it's his sister, and then I think it's his sister's friend, and then it's him again. I haven't read this in a long time, so I'm a bit iffy on what happens and how exactly it goes. But basically it's just the start of his school life. So he's 10 years old and he's never been to school before, and it's about him making friends, making enemies, how he deals with the school bullies, how he feels about himself in relation to other people that aren't related to him. The second book that I read this year was Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life Volume 1 in colour. This is by Brian Lee O'Malley. I think he writes them, but he might also do all the drawings. And this is one of, I think, 5 or 6 volumes. I only have the first one, and I am going to buy the rest of them because I really love this book. It's a comic book, or it's not really manga, I wouldn't say, or anime, but it is just a beautiful comic book. This book and the rest of the series is what the film Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is based off of, a film which I really, really like, and I hadn't read the story, but I knew that the film and the stories were quite similar, and it's one of very few comics that I own, but it has got me more into comics, and I think it will mean that I start reading some more of them. The third book that I read this year was The Shadowhunters Codex by Cassandra Clare and Joshua Lewis. If you guys haven't watched any of my other videos and you don't know me in real life, then you might not know the fact that I absolutely friggin' adore Cassandra Clare. So, like, I think everything she writes is brilliant. It's funny, it's emotional, but it's not too corny. There's tension, and it's wonderful. Like, I really enjoyed everything she's written. So this is a companion text. I want to call it a religious text, but it's not religious because none of them are religious. But it's kind of like the guidebook to being a Shadowhunter. And it's just, like, it could have been done one of 2 ways. It could have been done, this is a really old book with loads and loads of information, and I still would have read that, and I still really, really, really would have enjoyed it. But actually, the way that it's done is, it looks like it was originally like a really old book, and then Clary, who's one of the main characters from the Mortal Instruments series, has kind of doodled in it and added loads of these gorgeous pictures. And it asks you questions. It asks the owner of the codex questions, and it's got Clary and Jace and Simon's answers, and kind of like them having conversations in the margins, and it's really cute. I think personally there was more stuff that I wanted to be in the codex. I wanted kind of like a history of Shadowhunters, and I wanted to know more than I think it told me. But considering that this is a companion book, it's not like, I don't know, I think it was, it didn't tell me as much as I wanted to know, but it did tell me a lot, and I really, really liked it. And this will definitely be the book that I start with when I do my Cassandra Clare reread this summer. Book 4 that I read this year was The Bad Beginning by Lemony Snicket. If you don't know what the series of Unfortunate Events books are, they're basically 13 books that follow the stories of the 3 Baudelaire orphans who kind of, in the first book, are sent to live with this Count Olaf. This is this guy in the front. They've never heard of him, they've never met him, but apparently he's some long lost relative and he's the closest one that lives in the city that they live in. Basically, he's a horrible, horrible person, and they try their very best to escape. It's wonderful. I really love these editions of these books. They're one of my very favourite kind of 8 to 12 age series. They have so many layers to them. If you've ever read them, like, I'm still asking myself questions about them, and I've finished all of them. You never really get a concrete answer about anything, and you can take it at several levels. So you can take it at the most basic level, that is, they manage to survive and like live their lives despite all these horrible things that keep happening all the time. Or you can look at it as, why do these things keep happening to these specific children, and why did their parents die in the first place, and why is everything so interlinked, and how do all of these people know each other? And they're just incredibly complex. And Daniel Handler, who is Lemony Snicket, has if I ever meet him, I think I'd be in awe, because the amount of effort it must have taken to plan out this series is incredible. Following from this book, book 5 was The Reptile Room. So this is the second book in the series, and in this book the 3 children go and live with someone who tells them to call him Uncle Monty. His full name is Montgomery, and he is a doctor that studies snakes. So that's going to go well. This is Sunny. She's the youngest of the Baudelaire children, and this is the incredibly deadly viper. If that doesn't tell you things about what's going to happen in this book, then I don't know what to say. Book 6 that I read this year was The Wide Window. In this book, the children go and live with their Aunt Josephine, who lives on Lake Lachrymose. The lake is full of leeches, and Aunt Josephine is terrified of pretty much everything, including the welcome mat, the door handle, the oven, the telephone, the windows, the cooker, anything with a sharp object near it. She's terrified of everything. In this picture on the front, you have Violet Baudelaire, who's the eldest, Klaus and Sunny, and they're on a boat in what appears to be the middle of the lake. Book 7 of this year was called The Miserable Mill. In this one, the 3 children go and live in a lumber mill, not owned by one specific adult, but generally by the mill as a whole. Unfortunately, the person who owns the mill and who is therefore in charge isn't really keen on children and decides that all 3 of them are appropriate mill workers. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but a 6-month-old baby who doesn't have all of her teeth doesn't really seem to me to be the best person to cut trees, albeit her teeth are very sharp. The front of this book has Klaus in front of the mill with broken glasses, and a man behind him shaking pots with a handkerchief over his face. Book 8 that I read this year was called The Austere Academy. In this book, the children go and live in a boarding school. This book has a girl on the front called Carmelita Spatz. She is hands down the most vile child you will ever read about. And of course, the 3 Baudelaires in the background. In this one, they're living in a boarding school, and they're kind of the responsibility of the school. The head teacher's horrible, and as usual throughout all of these books, Count Olaf does come after them again. Book 9 that I read this year was called The Ersatz Elevator. So in this book, the children go and live with 2 people called Mr. and Mrs. Squalor. Mr. Squalor's first name is Jerome, and Mrs. Squalor's first name is Esme. They both live on the very, very top floor of one of the tallest buildings in the city, and Esme is very concerned about what's in and what's out. And that's kind of why she decides to adopt the children, because at that point, orphans are in. Now if that doesn't tell you what kind of person she is, then read the book, you'll find out. Count Olaf comes to find them again, and in this cover you can see the 3 children falling down what appears to be an elevator shaft, with a woman stood at the top laughing. The 10th book that I read this year was called The Vile Village. In this book, the children are sent to live in a village that collectively looks after them. But what that really means is that they're sent to live with basically the handyman of the village, and are expected to help him do all of the chores for the whole village. On the front of this book, we have Sonny and Klaus climbing up a rope ladder, being attacked by a large flock of crows. The 11th book I read this year was called The Hostile Hospital. The front cover of this one you can't really see, but it's Violet lying on a bed with a balloon in front of her face, while Klaus and Sonny wear surgical masks and look on while standing next to her bed. In this book, the children go and work in a hospital and try and figure out a way of finally keeping Count Olaf off of their back. The 12th book that I read this year was called The Carnivorous Carnival. In this book, the children end up living in a carnival pretending to be freaks. The front cover of this book has Madame Lulu, the leader of the carnival, looking into a crystal ball in which she sees the 3 children in what appears to be the foreground of a tiger's mouth. Again, in this book, Count Olaf and his now much larger crew have come after them. The 13th book that I read this year was called The Slippery Slope. In this book, Klaus and Violet climb up a mountain to try and rescue their baby sister. As you can see from the front cover, it's ridiculously cold up this very, very steep mountain. The 14th book that I read this year was called The Grim Grotto, in which the 3 Baudelaire children and a new friend end up diving far underwater to try and find a cure for some very deadly mushrooms. The front cover shows the 3 Baudelaire orphans, Violet, Klaus and Sonny, in swimsuits. The 15th book that I read this year was called The Penultimate Peril, in which the 3 children end up working in Hotel Denouement. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Basically, they end up being porters for the hotel, while everyone from basically every other book appears at the hotel. Again, Count Olaf finds them, and again, hilarity but also sadness ensue, as is in every other book. The 16th book that I read this year was called The End. This is the last book in the series of unfortunate events. In this book, the children end up stranded on a desert island with Count Olaf and some strange villagers who've always lived on the island. This book ties off the series, but it also doesn't. So if you're looking for a book series that ends nicely, all wrapped in a bow, I wouldn't suggest this series, because it leaves you asking far more questions at the end than you had at the beginning. But if you're looking for a series that will make your brain hurt, make you love all of the characters, except for, like, you know, some of them. Count Olaf, I'm looking at you. No one likes you. Nope. Makes you ask questions about everyone you meet. Makes you ask questions about the author, like, all the time. And oddly also makes you laugh. Then I would definitely recommend this series. The 17th book that I read this year was called Who Could That Be at This Hour? Again by Lemony Snicket. This is the beginning of his new series that follows his life when he was 11 and working for the VFD. This series is very different and yet very similar to a series of unfortunate events. Being written in the first person, it's got a very different style, but as it's still the same person writing the books, you can still tell that Lemony Snicket's life has never been easy, to say the least. I think these books are a lot funnier and a lot more easygoing, but if you've read the series of unfortunate events books, you do get to meet some of the characters in their younger selves, which I think is really interesting. Several times during this book I thought I was going to get to meet the people who become the Baudelaire parents. The 18th book that I read this year was called When Did You See Her Last? And is the second book in Lemony Snicket's new series All the Wrong Questions. Again, this book was so funny and also really complicated, as I've come to expect from all of Lemony Snicket's books. The third one in this series, which I think is going to have 4 parts, is coming out either this year or next year. The 19th book that I read this year was called Specials by Scott Westerfeld. It's the end book in the trilogy of Uglies, Pretties and Specials. They were a beautiful trilogy with loads of fantastic world building and character development. The basic premise of the books is that when you turn 16 you have a surgery that makes you pretty, after which you can go and live with the rest of the people who've had the surgery. The idea of this book, I think, is something that's really important to think about, and the idea that we're also sucked up in what people look like, that actually the idea of beauty is not something that everyone even finds beautiful. Again, this isn't a book that I own, it's something that I borrowed from my school library. The 20th book that I read was also by Scott Westerfeld and also set in this universe. It's called Extras, and basically after he finished the trilogy, several people wrote to him and told him how much they wanted another book, so he wrote this one. This follows a girl in Japan, I think, and it happens after the events of the trilogy, so I can't really tell you what happens. But again, the character development for characters that we hadn't met until this point was incredible, and the characters from the original 3 books that appeared in this book again felt so realistic and very familiar because you'd already read about them in the trilogy. The 21st book that I read was called More Than This by Patrick Ness. Again, I borrowed this from a library and so don't have a copy to show you. More Than This follows the life of a young boy who wakes up on his front garden of a house that he moved out of 5 years ago, with the streets deserted and a coffin in the attic. It's about him trying to figure out why he's there, how he got there, and also trying to deal with what happened just before he woke up. This book was incredible, and the love story in it was so subtle but also so moving, and I really enjoy Patrick Ness's writing. He's written another short story that I've read, and I'm currently reading another of his books. I think his skill at writing character development and subplot is incredible, and I would definitely recommend this book. The 22nd book that I read this year was called The Day I Met Susie by Chris Higgins. This book follows the life of a girl who meets a new friend, and suddenly this friend starts imitating everything she does. She gets a job at the hair salon that she works at. She's on the same course as her. She flirts with her boyfriend. She makes friends with her friends and kind of turns them against her. And it's a very interesting look at what some people will do to get what they want. I thought it was a very well written book, but it wasn't my favourite book, and it's probably not something that means I'll read anything else by the author, because although it was interesting, it wasn't deeply moving and it wasn't something that I felt like I wanted to reread. The 23rd book that I read was called Girl Missing by Sophie Mackenzie. This book follows the story of Lauren, who was adopted, and in a project trying to find out who she is, she looks up missing children. There's then a link that shows them what the children might look like now, and she clicks on it and sees that it looks almost exactly like her. This leads her and her best friend Jam on a kind of wild goose chase to try and find who her real parents were. I really enjoyed this book, and I thought it was really nice and sweet, but also quite well written, and touched on some very deep subjects for something so short. The 24th, 5th and 6th books that I read this year were the Divergent trilogy. Of them, I only own Allegiant. I've read Divergent and Insurgent via my school library, and then this one was one that I hadn't read before, but finally got round to reading this year. Let's start with Divergent. I really like Divergent, and it was the second time that I read this book. It's still just as wonderful a second time round, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. If you don't know what the basic plotline of Divergent is, this girl Triss lives in a dystopian world where the society is divided into 5 factions: Abnegation, Candor, Erudite, Dauntless and Amity. Each faction has its own specific personality and also its own specific set of jobs. When you're 16, you get a test and you can then choose which faction to spend the rest of your life in. After choosing, if you choose a faction that you weren't born in, generally you get cut off from your family. Insurgent was again something that I'd already read, and it was a reread and still just as good the first time. I then read Allegiant, and if you've read Allegiant, you will know why I'm about that. If you haven't read Allegiant, I would advise that you go read it, because I really enjoyed the Divergent series. I just felt that this book was slightly too hurried, and I feel like it probably should have been a 4-book series with just a bit more of an explanation as to why things were going on the way they went on. I also really was not happy with the way that things ended for some of the characters in this book. You know who I'm talking about. The 27th book that I read this year was called 13 Reasons Why by Jay Asher. Again, a reread, and this is hands down one of my favourite dark contemporaries. This book follows the life of Clay Jensen for 24 hours. He comes home to discover that a package has been left on his front door and it's full of old cassette tapes. When he starts to listen to them, he realises that it's this girl Hannah who killed herself 2 weeks earlier. To make matters worse, Clay was actually in love with Hannah, and listening to these tapes, she tells him that if he's listening, he's one of the 13 reasons why she killed herself. This book is incredibly moving, and the writing is superb. The use of stop, rewind, fast forward and play made it very easy for you to kind of find natural breaks if you needed to stop after reading a passage of what Hannah had said, or after how Clay felt about something. It was a very moving story, and it isn't something that I'd recommend for all readers, because obviously it is something that's quite upsetting for a lot of people. It's a very moving story, and I think suicide is something that needs to be talked about more often. I would definitely recommend this book if you think it's your cup of tea. The 28th book that I read this year was called There Is No Dog by Meg Rossoff. This is the story of God. Except God isn't what you think, or even what I think. He's a teenage boy called Bob. So in this, Bob is responsible for everything that happens, only he doesn't really want to be. It's a very well imagined story, and the writing was really wonderful. I didn't particularly like the ending, but that was just personal preference, and I would definitely recommend this as well as any other of Meg Rossoff's book to anyone. The 29th book that I read this year was Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell. If you haven't already seen this, I have done a review of Fangirl, and it's such a beautiful book. I really loved reading this. It's about a girl called Kath who goes to college for the first time with her twin sister Ren. The story basically revolves around her and her struggles through college for the first year, meeting new people, including a boy that she really likes, but she doesn't really know how to communicate with him when she's scared to go outside and he has no problem striking up conversations with people that he meets on the street. It's a really beautiful and moving story, and I would definitely recommend anything by Rainbow Rowell to everyone in the world, ever. The 30th book that I read this year was another Rainbow Rowell book, Eleanor and Park, and again I've done a review of this. So this book follows two teenagers, Eleanor and Park. They live in America in the 1980s. Eleanor is a fat redhead girl, and Park is half American, half Korean. So obviously neither of them is exactly in the popular crowd. It talks about a lot of really beautiful things, and they strike up a friendship over comic books and mixtapes. It's beautiful and the characters are amazing, and I absolutely cannot wait for the film adaptation of this book, of which Rainbow Rowell is going to be the screenwriter, which I'm so excited about. The 31st book that I read this year was a book that I actually regret reading, and that doesn't happen very often, and that book was Hate List by Jennifer Brown. I have recorded a review of this book and it will be going up soon, but it was so bad. I picked it up and the premise sounds interesting. Basically, it's about a girl called Valerie whose boyfriend 3 months earlier went in school with a handgun and shot several people, including her. He then killed himself. The premise sounds really interesting, and if it had been written better, I'm sure I would have really enjoyed it. But unfortunately, there was no character development, the characters were really two-dimensional, and a lot of the things that happened in this book made absolutely no sense. Plot lines had massive holes in them, and things that were said between characters that, if you said those things, you wouldn't be able to take them back, and you definitely wouldn't be able to get around them. And I think it's a shame that this book was just so badly written. The 32nd book that I read this year was called How I Live Now, again by Meg Rossoff. This book is about a girl called Daisy, who goes to live with her cousins in England after her dad gets remarried and makes her stepmom pregnant. She then falls in love with one of her cousins, which I had issue with, but not as much as I thought I would, because actually these two characters are really, really beautiful together. Unfortunately, while all of this is going on, there has been the start of a Third World War, and although the war isn't the main point of the story, having it in the background was really subtly but brilliantly done. Because although you don't really know what the war's about or how it starts or even how it ends, you do see how it affected people, and this book was beautiful. The film adaptation, not so much. Just don't watch it. The 33rd book that I read this year was called The Future of Us by Jay Asher and Caroline Mackler. This book follows two teenagers who discover Facebook when they use the internet for the first time. That wouldn't be that interesting, except that this book is set in 1996 and Facebook won't be invented for another 8 years. So, time travel through a computer. This book is really sweet and quite easy to read. I liked it, although I was a bit disappointed that there wasn't more explanation of how they found Facebook. The 34th book that I read this year was called Anna and the French Kiss by Stephanie Perkins. If you haven't read anything by Stephanie Perkins, go and read them now. They are the most uplifting, beautiful contemporary fiction that I've ever read. This book follows Anna, who is American, but her dad, after becoming a semi-famous author, decides that he needs to send her to France to finish her last year of high school. Except he doesn't even send her to a French school, he sends her to a school called America in Paris, which is basically an American high school that is set in Paris. Other than her dad being a bit mean, this book follows her and her experiences in France and kind of falling in love for the first time. I thought it was incredibly well written and beautiful. The 35th book that I read was The Unbecoming of Mara Dyer by Michelle Hodkin. This book is about a girl called Mara Dyer, who a couple of months ago was in a traumatic incident that involved her best friend, her boyfriend and her boyfriend's sister. She was the only one that lived. Now her whole family has moved and she's trying to start her life over again. But unfortunately, she suffers from PTSD and she can't tell if the things that are happening to her are real or whether she's just hallucinating. This book was incredibly well written, and despite finishing it and its sequel, I still don't know if Mara is telling the truth ever. Leading straight on from that, the 36th book that I read was The Evolution of Mara Dyer, the second in what I believe is going to be a trilogy. Again, the book was just as superbly written as the first one, and the evolution of the characters and the story was incredible. Just when you think you can't get any more invested and things can't get either any worse or any better, somehow they do, and then everything goes to shit. It was a beautiful book, and I absolutely cannot wait for the next book to come out. The 37th book that I read was Lola and the Boy Next Door, also by Stephanie Perkins. This is the sequel in what's going to be a trilogy that follows on from Anna and the French Kiss. In this book, we're in San Francisco following Lola and the boy next door to her called Cricket. We also get to have a look at Anna and some other characters from the first book who now have gone back after finishing their senior year to live in San Francisco to go to college. Again, Stephanie Perkins' writing is amazing, and I really, really loved these characters just as much as I loved the ones from Anna and the French Kiss. I cannot wait for the third book to come out. The 38th book that I read this year was Dash and Lily's Book of Dares by Rachel Cohen and David Lethian. This book follows Dash and Lily as they kind of tell each other things to do in New York City over Christmas time through the communication of a red notebook. I thought it was quite sweet and really easy reading, although not incredibly moving, and I wasn't too happy with the ending just because I thought it ended slightly too quickly. The 39th and 40th books that I read this year were called Sister Missing and Missing Me. They're two sequels to the book Girl Missing by Sophie Mackenzie. Again, these are library books, so I don't have something to show you, but they look something like this. In these books, you kind of see how life for Lauren is now with both of her families, and kind of what it is that's happening to them and how they deal with these things. The third book is less about Lauren and more about one of her sisters and kind of how similar they are in some very odd ways. The 41st book that I read was this massive brick of a thing called City of Heavenly Fire by Cassandra Clare. If you haven't seen it, I have done a review of this book, and I've also done a review of the UK launch, which I was lucky enough to go to. This book is the last in the Mortal Instruments series and is beautiful. It made me laugh, it made me cry, it made me want to throw it out of a window. This book makes you feel all of the emotions, all of the feelings, and I was very happy with this as a conclusion. Obviously I still want more about these characters, but I can understand that any more would just be about their day-to-day life, and not everyone is as obsessive about book characters as I am. The 42nd book I have lent to a friend, so I can't show you, but it's The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. If you haven't read this book, I would definitely recommend it, although I should warn you that it is set in the time of World War II, and therefore there is a lot of war and also the Holocaust going on in the background. It's a beautiful book about a young girl called Liesel, who is adopted by two people called Rosa and Hans. It's about her life and how she lives during the years of war. I thought it was incredibly moving and beautifully written. The whole book is narrated by Death, and although that sounds kind of sinister, it's just so beautiful. I read this after watching the film, and despite the fact that I haven't seen it again, I do think that that film was a beautiful adaptation. I would definitely recommend the book and the film, but be prepared to cry. 43rd book that I read this year, again I've lent to a friend so I can't show you, but it's We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. It's actually the June Booksplosion book of the month, which is being run by Catty Tastic, Ariel Bissett, Jessie the Reader and Pole and Bananas Books, I believe. It's a fantastic book, but I'm not going to tell you much about it because if you haven't read it, it's definitely one that you want to go into not knowing anything about it. The 44th book that I read this year was called Why We Broke Up by Daniel Handler. As you may have noticed earlier, I have read several other of his books, but they've all been under the name Lemony Snicket. This book is by Daniel Handler under his true name, and it's fraught with beautiful, beautiful illustrations, which you can't see because I'm turning the pages too quickly. But beautiful illustrations. The whole book is a letter to Ed from Min about why it is that they broke up, by retelling their entire relationship and all of the things that were wrong with it. It's beautiful, and I think it really captures well the whole being in love for the first time and being in love with someone who actually you have nothing in common with, but you're so busy being in love with them that you don't notice that you don't really like them as a person. The 45th book that I read this year was Attachments. This is another Rainbow Rowell book, but is the first one of her adult books that I've read. It basically follows the life of a guy called Lincoln, who monitors emails in a newspaper. Through this, he sees the communications of two women in the office and starts to fall for one of them, which obviously leads to some slight awkwardness considering that they've never actually met. I thought it was a beautiful book because, again, Rainbow Rowell's writing is amazing and fantastic, and you should definitely go and read everything she's ever written. The 46th book that I read this year was called Love Letters to the Dead by Ava Delaria. I hope I'm saying that last name correctly. This book is about a girl who writes letters to dead people as a kind of therapy and communication. Earlier in the year she lost her sister, and this is about her first year of high school and how she deals with making new friends and falling in love for the first time when she's still quite damaged from what happened with her sister. The 47th book that I read this year was called The Spectacular Now by Tim Tharp. This book follows the life of Sutter, who is a teenage alcoholic, and how it is that he ends up falling in love with a girl called Amy, who, although there's nothing socially wrong with her, she's just not part of any in crowd. It's a beautiful story and incredibly moving. The 48th book that I read this year was called The Maze Runner by James Dashner. If you haven't read this book, the film is coming out in September, so I definitely recommend reading it before the film. I really did like this book, and although when I picked it up I had my doubts because of things that I'd been told about how irritating it was, I was only irritated for the first third of this book, and after I pushed through that, things became a lot less annoying. The only reason that I found it annoying at all was because people never seemed to explain why they weren't telling each other things. It was just, I'm not going to tell you because I'm not going to tell you. and although people do that, it's annoying in real life, and the reactions that people have when that's done to them are a lot more aggressive than they were in this book. But actually, it's a really good book, and I cannot wait to read the next one. The 49th book that I've completed this year, it's one that I've already talked about on YouTube, and it's The Fault in Our Stars. I still haven't taken any of the bookmarks out of it from my last talk about this book. I love this book, as I love pretty much anything that John Green has written, and it made me laugh, it made me cry, it made me want to punch things, but it's beautiful. And if you haven't read this, I would question where it is that you've been for the past, 3 years, because it, might have been living under a rock. If so, buy this book and read it. I will do another one of these wrap-ups in December, but for now, that's all of the books that I've read between January and June. I shall see you guys next time. Bye. The third book that I read this year was the Shadowhunters Codex. Clever, so